I noticed something weird about how the Intel GPUs report their memory usage in my stats counters up here, so I want to clear that up right at the start before I just get a million questions about it in the comment section. So this is the reported VRAM allocation, and this is the reported VRAM per process usage. That's the first and second memory number on the three GPUs. What's weird here is that the A750, which is on our far left here, is reporting an allocation of almost 10 gigabytes when the GPU only has 8 gigabytes. Now, this is not how most GPUs behave when reporting their stats to this stats counter. So I'm using MSI Afterburner with its built-in Riva Tuner statistics server. That's how I get all these stats. I do get that question in the comment section sometimes. And then you enable what you want to see. Now, what happens on all the other GPUs, like Nvidia and AMD GPUs, is if you have an 8 gigabyte card, like the RTX 4060, for example, if it will never show more VRAM allocated than what it actually has on the card. What you see instead is you'll get near your 8 gigabyte limit, for example, and then you'll notice your system RAM go up, where basically what's happening is the VRAM is spilling over into system RAM, which is, I think, what's happening here. For example, our A770 in the middle here, which has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, is reporting an allocation of almost 12 gigabytes of VRAM, an actual per process usage of a little bit over 9. And notice that the system RAM here is allocating almost 17 gigabytes, but only reporting a per process usage of a little bit under 7 gigabytes. Whereas if I look at my 8 gigabyte cards, the per process usage on system RAM is around 12 gigabytes here, around 10 gigabytes here. In other words, it does look like the 8 gigabyte cards are spilling over VRAM into system RAM, but for some reason the Intel GPU reports, I think the allocation, my guess here, is that somehow it's reporting what is allocated for the game, and then if it doesn't have that, it does spill over into system RAM, but still reports an allocation of what the game's requesting or something like that. Which is just different behavior than how I see the AMD and Nvidia cards report their stats to this stat program. So I just wanted to mention that at the beginning of the video, as well as that's an interesting thing to talk about with the VRAM situation here. Because in this video, we're going to be looking at the Intel Arc A750, which is an 8 gigabyte card, against the A770, which is a 16 gigabyte card, although it has an 8 gigabyte version. I'm testing the 16 gigabyte version. And then against the RTX 4060, which is an 8 gigabyte card. Let's also talk about their pricing right now. So if I go to somewhere like PC Part Picker, they're not sponsored or anything like that. It's just a convenient way to compare new prices at many major retailers all at once and sort price low to high. The RTX 4060 is still sitting at its MSRP of $300. The A750, on the other hand, has had its price cut to around $220 on a couple of models and is currently available as low as $210 on the ASRock Challenger. Now, in this video, I'm testing the Intel Limited Edition cooler, and again, that looks like $220, but again, the lowest price right now would be $210 if you were buying an A750. Now, the A770, like I said, has an 8 gigabyte model and a 16 gigabyte model. For reasons you'll see in this video, I don't think it makes sense to buy the 8 gigabyte model or maybe even the 16 gigabyte model because the A770 is not that much faster than the A750 anyway. But I guess my point is I'm testing the 16 gigabyte version, and specifically I am testing the Acer Predator Bifrost OC version that I purchased for the channel. Now, I also want to mention that the Intel Limited Edition version, which is their own branded cooler, 16 gigabyte model, has reportedly ended production and will not come back in stock. So I do think the Predator Bifrost is the, I think, only 16 gigabyte version that is still in production. Now, this is a $320 card, so that means that the A770 has to be better than the 4060 to be able to justify this price point if we're looking at the 16 gigabyte model. Whereas the A750, on the other hand, if we're looking at a value comparison, it does not need to actually be better than the 4060 since it costs significantly less. Now, Another thing to keep in mind with the Intel Arc GPUs is you definitely need to have ResizeBAR enabled and supported on your motherboard, and I do have that enabled for these tests. Also, I'm testing the latest games, which actually is kind of giving Intel a bit of a softball. A lot of where they tend to struggle is in older games that are using older versions of DirectX. Whereas the games I'm testing in this video are new games using DX12, so I'm giving Intel kind of the best look that it can get, and let's see how it stacks up in the benchmarks, and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. Let's start out with a major cross-platform AAA release, Star Wars Jedi Survivor 1080p Epic, pushing Unreal Engine 4 about as far as it can go. And here we're seeing the 4060 18% ahead of the A750 at 1080p Epic settings, but the A750 is averaging around 60 frames per second. The A770 is kind of splitting the difference at around 65 FPS, with the 4060 at about 71, putting the A770 about 8% ahead of the A750. Although the 1% lows are a bit more of a mess, you can see the A770 ended up having a few more spikes on the frame time graph, putting it actually at the bottom of the pack. Now, if we turn ray tracing on, we now see the 4060 take a more commanding lead. It now has a 61% lead over the A750, averaging 61 FPS versus 38 FPS. The A770 is averaging 43 FPS through this benchmark run, which only puts it 13% ahead of the A750, but that is a little bit more than what we saw with ray tracing disabled. And here the A750's screen blanks out. Now the stats and frame time graph and everything still seem to be running smoothly in the background, so I don't think that's affecting the performance results. But my A750 did not like connecting to my capture card. This screen would frequently blank out despite using exactly the same cables and setup and everything that I use on all of the other GPUs that I test, which aren't having the same issues. Anyway, if we go up to 1440p Epic settings, we now see the Arc GPUs doing much better relatively to the 4060, or the 4060 doing much worse, whichever way you want to look at it. But now the A770 actually does take the lead at 45 FPS, with the 4060 almost tied at 44 FPS, and the A750 not too far behind at 41 FPS, although its screen does randomly blank out at times. So here, none of them are delivering an amazing experience, but is certainly playable, and the Arc GPUs were doing better. However, if we turn ray tracing on, we now see the 4060 take a pretty big lead once again. Now the A750 is only averaging 27 frames per second. The A770 is 22% ahead of that, offering 33 frames per second. But the 4060 is offering 41 frames per second, which does place it 52% ahead of the A750, and the A770 is kind of right there in the middle. The 1% lows also show a significant advantage for the RTX 4060, which is 62% ahead of the A750, offering 34 FPS in the 1% lows versus 21. Now, let's move on to Unreal Engine 5, although this is a less demanding game overall. This is the first major third-party, well, I don't know if it's major, but the first third-party release in Unreal Engine 5, so I tested this out. It has Lumen lighting system, but not Nanite. At 1080p high, we see all GPUs doing well, with the 4060 34% ahead of the A750, and the A770 only 3% ahead of the A750. If we turn the hardware ray tracing acceleration for Lumen on, we now see the 4060 expand its lead to 37% over the A750, and once again, the A770 is only 3% ahead of the A750. But all the GPUs are very playable here. The A750 at about 63 FPS, the A770 at 65, and the 4060 averaging 86. If we go up to 1440p resolution, all the GPUs have a bit more trouble here, but the RTX 4060 is able to average 59 FPS, whereas the A750 was averaging 49 and the A770 at 53, kind of splitting the difference. So the 4060 here has a 20% lead over the A750, and the A770 has an 8% lead over the A750. If we turn ray tracing on, The 4060 has a 27% lead over the A750, and the A770 has a 7% lead over the A750, with only the 4060 getting very close to a 60 FPS average at 57, whereas the A770 was at 48 and the A750 at 45, although we're certainly going to see much more demanding Unreal Engine 5 games soon. Let's move on to another cross-platform game that's a next, current-gen console only. A Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p Ultra. And while the Arc GPUs do well on the averages, they're 1% lows. And look at the frame time graphs. They're showing all these little micro stutters. It's not great. But the overall results is basically a tie. The 4060 is only 3% ahead of the A750, and the A770 is only 2% ahead of the A750. It's a 1 FPS separation on the averages, although, like I said, the 1% lows were much better for the Nvidia GPU. Going up to 1440p Ultra, we actually see the A770 pull ahead of the 4060 by 7%, and the A750 ahead by 2%, and the 1% lows now are a lot more even as well, although the 4060 is technically ahead by 6%. So much better results for the Arc GPUs at 1440p, although my A750 is still continuing to fight with my capture card. Let's move on to some PlayStation 5 exclusives. And the first time I tested the Arc GPUs on this, they couldn't even boot the game. That was a month or so ago, and now on the latest patch, they actually can boot the game, but their performance is not looking great. At 1080p Ultra, we are seeing the 4060 doubling the performance of the A750 at 76 FPS versus 38 FPS. And we're seeing the A770 just matching the performance of the A750. Technically, it's actually about 1% less, but I think that's just variance between runs. Now, if we move down to the high settings, I don't really know how to explain this other than maybe the game is not loading in the full textures on the A750, although I'm struggling to spot the differences. But I'm actually seeing my A750 ahead of my A770 now. Although the 4060 is still doubling the performance of the A770 at 93 FPS versus 51 and 44 respectively. This was a strange result. Again, I'm wondering if part of the game that I'm just missing in the visuals is maybe not loading in properly on the 8GB A750. Anyway, moving over to 1440p at the Ultra settings. Now, none of the GPUs are doing great. The 8GB on the 4060 is certainly not wonderful here, but it's still well ahead of the 16GB A770, which doesn't seem to be liking this game very much. We're seeing the 4060 with a 45% lead over the A750, which is at 29 FPS, and the A770 only at 30 FPS, and the 4060 at 42 FPS. Although the 1% lows do show a bigger advantage for the 770 versus the 750. If we do 1440p high settings, now we're seeing the A770 much ahead of the A750, 36 FPS versus 20 FPS, and the 4060 just well ahead of all of them, averaging 61 FPS. And the 1% lows, again, the A770 is 61% ahead of the A750 with 29 versus 18, and the 4060, the 1% lows is 56. So basically what we're seeing here is this game's a bit of a mess for the Arc GPUs, but at least they run it now. Again, when I tried testing this game a month or so ago, they couldn't even boot. So anyway, moving on to other PS5 games with Returnal at 1080p Epic, we're seeing the Arc GPUs back to more of what we were seeing before, where the 4060 has a lead, but not amazingly. It's at 28% ahead of the A750. The A770 is 8% ahead of the A750. They're all doing well, though, with a 65 FPS average for the A750, 70 for the A770, and 83 for the 4060. Moving up to 1440p Epic settings, we're once again seeing the Arc GPUs pull much closer to the 4060. Here we're seeing the A750 offering 52 FPS, the A770 57, and the 4060 61. That puts the A770 10% ahead of the A750, and the 4060 17% ahead of the A750. So again, in this game and at 1440p especially, the Arc GPU is pulling much closer. Now, one more PlayStation 5 exclusive that has been ported to PC is Forspoken. 1080p ultra-high preset, which does include some ray tracing. We see the 4060 offering 50 FPS average, the A750 offering 38, and the A770 offering 45. So the A770 is 18% ahead of the A750. It's extra VRAM, I think, paying off there, and the 4060, 28% ahead of the A750. Now, if we move on to the 1440p resolution, we now finally see the, I think the 16 gigabytes versus 8 paying off a bit here on the A770, where, again, moving up to 1440p, more VRAM usage, all of that. The A770 is matching the performance of the 4060. They're both at 34 FPS, which isn't great. And the A750 is hanging out at 28 FPS. So the 770 and 4060 are 21% ahead of the A750. Let's move to some cross-gen titles. Let's look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at the 1080p balanced preset. At these settings, we're seeing the RTX 4060 51% ahead of the A750 with 143 FPS versus 95, and the A770 gets you 102 FPS, putting it 7% ahead of the A750. And the 1% lows see 100 FPS on the 4060 versus 73 and 79 respectively on the Intel GPUs. At 1440p balanced, we're now seeing the Arc GPUs once again scale better than they did at 1440p, although this still seems to be a good title for the RTX 4060. It's averaging 99 FPS versus 74 on the A750 and 80 on the A770. That puts the A770 8% ahead of the A750 and the 4060 34% ahead of the A750. Now, let's look at Resident Evil 4 Remake at 1080p maximum preset, which does include ray tracing, and here we are seeing the A770's 16 gigabytes of VRAM pay off. This setting in this game is very VRAM heavy, and the A770 is now 67 FPS versus the 4060 at 56 and the A750 at 46, putting the 4060 22% ahead of the A750, but the A770 46% ahead of the A750, the 4060 kind of pulling in the middle there. If we go down to the prioritized graphics settings, which uses a lot less VRAM, it also kicked on FSR2 quality on some of the GPUs, so I enabled it on all of them to keep things fair. The GPUs are much closer together here, and the A770 is really barely ahead of the A750, 119 FPS versus 116 FPS, and the 4060 hitting 135 FPS. So we certainly see that at the max preset, the 16 gigabyte VRAM was a big advantage for the A770, but we're not seeing that happen at the lower settings. Moving up to 1440p resolution and going back to the maximum preset, which again includes some ray tracing, we're once again seeing the A770 benefit relatively to the other GPUs with 54 FPS versus 42 on the 4060 and 34 on the A750. That puts the 4060 24% ahead of the A750, but the A770 is 59% ahead of the A750. Although honestly, I'm not that impressed by the ray tracing in this game anyway. So if you go down to the prioritized graphics preset at 1440p, but again, this is enabling the FSR2 quality mode upscaling, we're now seeing the GPUs much closer together. Again, at 1440p, especially the Arc GPUs seem to catch up to the 4060. The 4060 is ahead with 95 FPS versus 94 on the A770 and 88 on the A750. So the A770 is 7% ahead of the A750, and the 4060 is 8% ahead of the A750, although the 1% lows were a little more mixed up there. If we take a look at Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p Ultra, we see the 4060 offering 81 FPS, the A770 offering 77, and the A750 offering 71 when using the built-in benchmark. That puts the 4060 14% ahead of the A750, and the A770 is 9% ahead of the A750. So fairly close results in this one. Now let's go ahead and kick it up to 1440p. And as expected, the Arc GPUs are doing better relatively at 1440p than they did at 1080p, and now actually the 4060 is the furthest behind, offering 49 FPS versus 50 FPS on the A750, though it continues to disconnect and black screen on my capture card, and my A770 is offering 55 FPS, putting it 12% ahead of the RTX 4060, and the A750 and the 4060 are basically tied, although the A750 was again 1 FPS faster. But let's look at some heavy-duty ray tracing. At 1080p ray tracing ultra preset, We see none of the GPUs doing great. The A750 offering 28 FPS, the A770 offering 30 FPS, and the 4060 offering 34 FPS, which is technically a 21% lead over the A750, and the A770 has a 7% lead over the A750, but in general, I don't think many people would choose to play this game at 30 FPS. So if you enable upscaling, we can now look at XeSS upscaling versus DLSS quality. And then we can also look at frame generation, although on the far right there, although I'm not factoring that into my relative performance results because those frames aren't really the same as normal frames. And here we're seeing the A770 offering 47 FPS versus the A750 offering 44 FPS, and the 4060 offering 59 FPS, which does put it 34% ahead of the A750. And image quality-wise, I think that I just don't like upscaling at 1080p at all. But if you were going to, well, I do think DLSS does have a bit of an image quality advantage here. XeSS does put up a pretty decent fight, although frame generation then offers you an interesting option on the 4060. It does increase latency and can add its own image quality artifacts, but it does smooth the overall motion. With a high enough base frame rate, it works pretty well, which I think is what we're seeing here. I'll talk more about it in the final thoughts section. So for my final thoughts, I like to do a little bit of division with the prices and then think about how that compares to the performance differences that we saw in the benchmarks. So we saw that the A770 16GB at $320 versus the RTX 4060 at $300. If you divide those, you get 1.07-ish if you round it. In other words, the A770 16GB is about 7% more expensive than the RTX 4060. And so to make sense, it would need to be at least 7% better, right, to offer the same kind of value. And the A750, on the other hand, at $210 versus the $300 price of the 4060, makes the 4060 about 1.43 times the price of the A750, meaning that the 4060 needs to be about 43% faster than the A750 to offer the same value in terms of like performance per dollar, right? Now, there's more to this than just performance per dollar, though. There's features, game support, stability, all of that, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But I thought the other interesting thing to look at here is what a bad value the A770 is compared to the A750 in gaming performance. Because if we look at $320 versus $210, the A770 16GB at the current prices available today is 52% more expensive than the A750, but did we almost ever see it offer 52% better performance? I think the answer is pretty much no, other than one or two places where there was some heavy, I think, VRAM spillover. So with these kinds of numbers in mind, I think my first conclusion is, again, if we kind of scroll through some results here quickly, and just kind of look at the percentage differences for the A770 versus the A750. You know, if you're kind of staring right there, is the A770, I mean, oftentimes it's basically tied or only a little bit ahead of the A750, although we did see some places where I think VRAM was spilling over badly enough that the A770 did kind of pay off versus the A750. But the general result is usually 10% or less better than the A750, unless, again, the VRAM kicks in which case it maybe justifies its price, but only when we're spilling over the 8 gigabytes of VRAM pretty heavily. Which means that I think if you think about in terms of value between the two Intel GPUs, the A750 offers far better value and performance per dollar than the A770. Now, when comparing against the RTX 4060, I again think that the A770 has a bit of a value problem. The A770 costs more than the 7% more than the RTX 4060. However, in most but not all of the tests, the RTX 4060 is coming out either similar or more often better performance than the A770. So it looks like, at least in my testing in the latest games, the 4060 offers similar or more likely better performance and certainly more consistent performance game by game than the A770 does while costing less. The A770 does have twice the VRAM capacity, which does occasionally pay off, but not very frequently. So I think in the vast majority of situations, the 4060 is going to outperform the A770, and it's going to do it for, at the current prices, less money. And again, then you get the Nvidia features like frame generation, better general support in a lot of software, and again, I was testing the latest DX12 games. If you go back to older games, you're more likely to run into games that Intel either just doesn't work on or just gives you really low frame rates, things like that, whereas you'll have a much smoother experience on Nvidia. Where I think Intel was putting up a much better fight was with the 8GB cards against each other, with the A750 versus the 4060. Now, the 4060 does seem to outperform the A750, I believe, in virtually every test other than a couple that are basically a tie, where sometimes we did still have some issues on the Arc GPUs in the 1% lows. So, is the 4060 better than the 750 scrolling through these results? Yes, the 4060 is better than the 750, but the problem is it's often not better by that much, especially when you're playing at 1440p, although I think both GPUs are better targeted at 1080p. So I think in terms of raw performance per dollar, the A750 is offering better bang for the buck than the 4060 was. However, you do then run into the, NVIDIA features, things like that. We do have frame generation, which Intel does not currently have a competitor against. XeSS, image quality-wise, does put up a pretty good fight against DLSS. I think it does put up a better fight than AMD's FSR, actually. But you do run into, game support list issues where DLSS is supported in more games. And again, there's frame generation, all of that. And then we do have, like I said, support issues in older titles, things like that. So there's still reasons why the A750 still might not be the card that you want to buy, although it is certainly offering a lot of bang for the buck at that $210 price point. Now, I'll probably revisit the A750 up against cards that cost a similar price in the future. I did 4 months ago test out the 3050, the 6600 XT, and the A750 up against each other. At that time, the prices were a bit different. They were all closer to $250, where they have come down a bit now. So I might revisit this comparison again soon to see what I think, because that's really the competitors for the A750 is cards like the 3050 and the 6600 XT and 6650 XT from AMD at a similar price point. But it is certainly an interesting comparison to look at how close the A750 can get to the 4060 in a lot of situations, while costing so much less. Anyway, hopefully you guys found this interesting. For me, I'm still gonna hesitate to recommend the Intel Arc GPUs. The A750 does seem to have certainly a value argument, but like you saw, it was having some issues connecting to my displays that I wasn't seeing on any other GPUs that I have in the exact same test conditions. Again, the older game support list, software support, it's all getting better, but I still think has a lot of growing room. And like I said, cards like the 6650 XT from AMD are often around a similar price point and offer similar or better performance a lot of the time as well. But that's really a topic for another video. Today we were looking at how Intel is stacking up against Nvidia, and the main conclusion was the A770, despite offering 16 gigabytes at a similar price to the 4060, doesn't usually outperform the 4060, so I don't think I would buy the A770 over the 4060. And the A750 is a more interesting proposition, but then really needs to be compared carefully against other GPUs at its same price point. And if you're deciding that you want to buy an Intel GPU, it certainly seems like the A750 is more more value than the A770 at the current pricing, looking at that 16 gigabyte model. All right, I hope you guys found this interesting and useful. Huge thank you to subscribers and especially channel members. Click that join button to directly support the channel. I'm trying to get more members, extras content out there, and all that is thank you for you guys. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.